Yoruba manufactured cloth, ironware, and pottery, which were exchanged for salt, leather, and, most importantly, horses from the Sudan to maintain the cavalry. Oyo remained strong for 200 years. It became a protectorate of Great Britain in 1888, before further fragmenting into warring factions. The Oyo state ceased to exist as any sort of power in 18th Benin. The Benin Empire was ruled by the Kwa-speaking Edo people, and by the mid-15th century it was engaged in political expansion and consolidation in the region. Under Obas King Eware, around 1450 to 1480 CE, the state was organized for conquest. He solidified central authority and initiated 30 years of war with his neighbors. At the time of his death, the Benin Empire extended to Dahomey in the west, to the Niger Delta in the east, along the West African coast, and to the Yoruba towns in the north. The Oba ruled with advice from the Uzama, a council consisting of chiefs of powerful families and town chiefs of different guilds. Later, its authority was diminished by the establishment of administrative dignitaries. In particular, Iwara's grandson Oba Esije, 1504 to 1550, eroded the power of the Uzama and increased contact and trade with Europeans, especially with the Portuguese, who provided a new source of copper for court art. After the 16th century, Benin mainly exported pepper, ivory, gum, and cotton cloth to the Portuguese and Dutch, who resold it to other African societies along the coast. Women wielded political power in the empire. For example, the Queen Mother, who produced a future Oba, wielded immense political influence. Benin was never a significant exporter of slaves. By the early 1700s, the empire was wrecked with dynastic disputes and civil wars. It regained much of its former power in the reigns of Oba Erazoyan and Oba Akingbuda. In 1897, the British sacked Benin City. Sungbo's Eredo and the walls of Benin were built amid 1st millennium CE, prior to 10th century CE. Niger Delta and Igbo. The Niger Delta comprised numerous city-states with numerous forms of government comparable to those of the Swahili people in East Africa. These city-states were protected by the waterways and thick vegetation of the Delta. Some, like Boni, Kalabari, and Wari, had kings. Others, like Brass, were republics with small senates, and those at Cross River and Old Calabar were ruled by merchants of the Ekpi society. The Ekpi society regulated trade and made rules for members known as house systems. Some of these houses, like the Pebbles of Boni, were well known in the Americas and Europe. The region was transformed by trade in the 17th century CE. The Igbo primarily lived east of the Delta, with the exception of the Anioma on the west side of the Delta. The Igbo kingdom of Nri rose in the 10th century CE, with Eze Nri denoting its leader. It was a political entity composed of villages, where each village was autonomous, independent with its own territory and name, and recognized by its neighbors. Villages were democratic, with all males and sometimes females a part of the decision-making process. Graves at Igbo Ukwu, 800 CE, contained brass artifacts of local manufacture and glass beads from Egypt or India, indicative of extra-regional trade. The Aro Confederacy was a political union orchestrated by the Igbo subgroup, the Aro people, centered in the Aro-Chukwu Kingdom in present-day southeastern Nigeria. It was founded at the end of the 16th century, and by the 18th and 19th centuries, their influence and presence reached across eastern Nigeria into parts of the Niger Delta and southern Igala. Later migrations. Through pathways taken by caravan or via travel amid the Almoravid period, a West African population, Igishtal sub-Saharan West Africans, may have introduced the 29 AYG thalassemia mutation, found in notable amounts among African Americans, into the North African region of Morocco. Painted rock art from Manding peoples are found largely in Mali, where Malinka and Bambara peoples reside. The Manding rock art, developed using black, white, or red paint, is primarily composed of geometric art forms, as well as animal, e.g. saurian, and human art forms. Some of the Manding rock art may relate to circumcision rituals for initiates. During the 15th century CE, migrations from the northern area of Guinea and southern area of Mali may have resulted in the creation of Manding rock art in the northern area of Mali, e.g. Yobri, Nabruk, southeastern area of Burkina Faso, e.g. Takutala, Sourkundingweye, and Dogon country. Slave trade. Following the collapse of the Songhai Empire in the 16th century CE, a number of smaller states arose across West Africa, including the Bambara Empire of Segu, the lesser Bambara Kingdom of Kaarta, the Fula Malinke Kingdom of Kasso in present-day Mali's Kayes region, and the Kenadougou Empire of Sikasso. European traders first became a force in the region in the 15th century, with the Fortimov establishment of a Portuguese trading post at Arguin Island, off the coast of present-day Senegal. By 1475, Portuguese traders had reached as far as the Bight of Benin. The Atlantic slave trade began almost immediately after this, based on the already well-established slave trading capacity of the Islamic world, with the Portuguese taking hundreds of captives back to their country for use as slaves. It began on grand scale after Christopher Columbus' voyages to the Americas and the subsequent demand for cheap colonial labor. In 1510, the Spanish crown initiated Spain's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade, and it was followed over the next centuries by other European states. By 1650, the slave trade was in full force at a number of sites along the coast of West Africa, and over the coming centuries would result in severely reduced growth for the region's population and economy. The expanding slave trade produced significant populations of West Africans living in the New World, recently colonized by Europeans. The oldest known remains of African slaves in the Americas were found in Mexico in early 2006 and are thought to date from the late 16th to mid-17th centuries. As the demand for slaves increased, some African rulers sought to supply the demand by constant war against their neighbors, resulting in fresh captives. States such as Dahomey in modern-day Benin and the Bambara Empire in modern-day Mali based much of their economy on the exchange of slaves for European goods, particularly firearms that they then employed to capture more slaves. During the colonial era, the Dutch colonial authorities in West Africa were active in recruiting African slaves into the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, known as Belanda Hittim, as it was believed that black Africans were more immune than Europeans to the tropical diseases present in the Dutch East Indies. Recruitment changed format after the Atlantic slave trade was abolished by European and American governments in the 19th century. For instance, Herjuan was the first year when only volunteers were accepted for the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army. Slavery in the Americas persisted in some capacity after the end of the Atlantic slave trade, until Brazil abolished it in 1888. Today, descendants of West Africans make up large and important segments of the population in Brazil, the Caribbean, the United States, and throughout the New World. A modern genetic research study of African Americans in several major U.S. cities concluded that their common ancestry originated most prominently in Western Africa, consistent with prior genetic studies and the history of the slave trade. Colonial period. Colonization of Africa. In 1725, the cattle-herding Fulanis of Fouta Djallon launched the first major reformist jihad of the region, overthrowing the local animist, Mande-speaking elites and attempting to somewhat democratize their society. A similar movement occurred on a much broader scale in the Hausa city-states of Nigeria. Under Uthman Dan Fodio, an imam influenced by the teachings of Sidi Ahmed al-Tijani, Uthman preached against the elitist Islam of the then-dominant Qadariya Brotherhood, winning a broad base of support amongst the common people. Uthman's Fulani Empire was soon one of the region's largest states and inspired the later jihads of Massina Empire founder Sekou Ahmadu in present-day Mali and the cross-Sudan Tukulur conqueror El Hajj Umar Tall. At the same time, the Europeans started to travel into the interior of Africa to trade and explore. Scottish explorer Mungo Park, 1771 to 1806, made the first serious expedition into the region's interior, tracing the Niger River as far as Timbuktu. French armies followed, not long after. In 1774, it was noted that the extensive coastline and deep rivers of Africa had not been utilized for correspondence or commerce, even though maps in the same volume clearly show the Gum Coast, Grain Coast, Ivory Coast, and Gold Coast, Malachy. Postlethwaite writes in this book, "It is melancholy to observe that a country which has near 10,000 miles seacoast, and noble, large, deep rivers should yet have no navigation, streams penetrating into the very center of the country, but of no benefit to it, innumerable people without knowledge of each other, correspondence, or commerce." Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa was the invasion, conquest, and colonization of most of Africa by 7 Western European powers driven by the Second Industrial Revolution during the late 19th century and early 20th century in the era of new imperialism. Belgium, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. In 1870, 10% of the continent was formally under European control. By 1914, this figure had risen to almost 90%. The only states retaining sovereignty were Liberia, Ethiopia, Egba, Hausa, Senussia, Mbunda, the Dervish state, and the Ovambo kingdoms, most of which were later conquered. The 1884 Berlin Conference regulated European colonization and trade in Africa and is seen as emblematic of the Scramble. In the last quarter of the 19th century, there were considerable political rivalries between the European empires, which provided the impetus for the colonization. The later years of the 19th century saw a transition from informal imperialism, military influence, and economic dominance to direct rule. With the decline of the European colonial empires in the wake of the 2 world wars, most African colonies gained independence during the Cold War and decided to keep their colonial borders in the Organization of African Unity Conference of 1964 due to fears of civil wars and regional instability, placing emphasis on Pan-Africanism. In the Scramble for Africa in the 1880s, Europeans started to colonize the inland of West Africa, as they had previously mostly controlled trading ports along the coasts and rivers. Samori Touré's newly founded Wassulo Empire was the last to fall. And with his capture in 1898, military resistance to French colonial rule effectively ended. France dominated West Africa, followed by Britain. Small colonial operations were held by Germany until 1914, and also by Spain and Portugal. Only Liberia was independent before 1958. After the slave trade died out, Denmark and the Netherlands sold off their small holdings. Britain operated from 4 small colonies on the West African coast, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, Lagos, and the Niger. British trade in tropical products reached £4 million per year and was entirely handled by a small number of resident merchants. There were no permanent British settlers or military bases. The posts were held entirely for trade purposes, and also as calling stations. London had no long-term plans to join them together or go inland. British diplomats negotiated military agreements with local tribes who needed British protection from the expansionist Ashanti tribes. Britain fought repeated Anglo-Ashanti wars in the Gold Coast in 1823. 1824 to 1831, 1864, 1894, 1895, and 1900. Only the last two were clear British victories. French pretensions in West Africa were much more ambitious and involved not just trade, but rebuilding the French Empire and bringing new populations into the umbrella of French civilization and Catholicism. There were dreams of consolidating a vast African empire by expanding south from the Mediterranean into the Sahara Desert, moving east toward the Nile River, and moving south toward King Leopold's Congo. Post-colonial period. Following World War II, campaigns for independence sprang up across West Africa, most notably in Ghana, under the Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah, 1909 to 1972. Ghana became the first country of sub-Saharan Africa to achieve independence in 1957, followed by Guinea under the guidance of Sékou Touré the next year. After a decade of protests, riots, and clashes, French West Africa voted for autonomy in a 1958 referendum, dividing it into the states of today. Most of the British colonies gained autonomy the following decade. Out of the 17 nations that achieved their independence in 1960, the Year of Africa, 9 were West African countries. Many founding fathers of West African nations like Nkrumah, Touré, Leopold Sédar Senghor, Modibo Keïta, Sylvanus Olympio, Felix Houphouët-Boigny, Siaka Stevens, and Abubakar Tafawa Balewa consolidated their power during the post-independence 1960s by gradually eroding democratic institutions and civil society. In 1973, Guinea Bissau proclaimed its independence from Portugal and was internationally recognized following the 1974 Carnation Revolution in Portugal. West African political history since independence has been characterized by African socialism. Senghor, Nkrumah, and Touré all embraced the idea of African socialism, whereas Houphouët-Boigny and Liberia's William Tubman remained suspicious of it. 1983 saw the rise of socialist Thomas Sankara era, often titled the Che Guevara of Africa, to power in Burkina Faso. Since independence, West Africa has suffered from the same problems as much of the African continent, particularly dictatorships, political corruption, and military coups. At the time of his death in 2005, for example, Togo's Etienne Ayadema was among the world's longest-ruling dictators. International conflicts have been few, with Mali and Burkina Faso's nearly bloodless Agadir Strip War a rare exception. Civil wars. The region of West Africa has seen a number of civil wars in its recent past, including the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970, 2 civil wars in Liberia, 1989 to 1997 and 99 to 2003, a decade of fighting in Sierra Leone, 1991 to 2002, the Guinea Bissau Civil War, 1998 to 1999, and 2 recent conflicts in Côte d'Ivoire, 2002 to 2007 and 2010 to 2011. Nigerian Civil War, 1960 to 1970. The Nigerian Civil War, 6 July to 15 January 1970, also known as the Biafran War, was fought between Nigeria and the Republic of Biafra, a secessionist state which had declared its independence from Nigeria in 1967. Nigeria was led by General Yakubu Gowon, and Biafra by Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Emeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. The conflict resulted from political, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions which preceded the United Kingdom's formal decolonization of Nigeria from 1960 to 1963. Immediate causes of the war in 1966 included a military coup, a counter-coup, and anti-Igbo pogroms in the northern region. The pogroms and the exodus of surviving Igbos from the northern region to the Igbo homelands in the eastern region led the leadership of the eastern region, whose population was 2/3 Igbo, to conclude that the Nigerian federal government would not protect them and that they must protect themselves in an independent Biafra. After gaining full independence from the British Empire in 1963, Nigeria established the First Republic, which was heavily influenced by British democracy and relied on majority rule. In less than 3 years, though the Republic fell after a successful coup d'etat led by southern Nigerian rebels on 15th of January 1966, the fall of the First Republic increased political, economic, ethnic, cultural, and religious tensions between North and South Nigeria, which had been present since colonial times. This led to the military governor of southeastern Nigeria, Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, seceding southeastern Nigeria, citing northern massacres and electoral fraud. The independent state became known as the Republic of Biafra. Northern Nigeria opposed the claim of southern secession, and the Nigerian government called for police action in the area. The armed forces of Nigeria were sent in to occupy and take back the Republic of Biafra. Nigerian forces successfully seized Biafra through the capture of Nsukka, the capture of Ogoja, capture of Abakaliki, and the capture of Enugu. Their military successes were largely due to the advantaged army of Nigeria. By 970, Biafran General Chukwuemeka Odumegwu fled to the neighboring nation of Côte d'Ivoire, and Biafra surrendered due to lack of resources and leadership. The secessionist state officially reunited with northern Nigeria on 15 January 1970. The conflict is estimated to have killed roughly 1 million people. First Liberian Civil War, 1989-97. The First Liberian Civil War was an internal conflict in Liberia from 1989 until 1997. The conflict killed about 250,000 people, and eventually led to the involvement of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the United Nations. The peace did not last long, and in 1999, the Second Liberian Civil War broke out. In 1980, Samuel Doe led a coup that overthrew the elected government. In 1985, he held elections that were widely considered fraudulent, leading to an unsuccessful coup attempt by General Thomas Kwiwankpa. In December 1989, former government minister Charles Taylor moved into the country from the neighboring Ivory Coast to start an uprising meant to topple the Doe government. The National Patriotic Front of Liberia, NPIL, led by Taylor, soon splintered and devolved into battle with Prince Johnson's rebel group, the Independent National Patriotic Front of Liberia, INPFL, for control in the capital, Monrovia. In 1990, Johnson seized control of the capital and executed Doe brutally. Second Liberian Civil War, 1999 to 2003. The Second Liberian Civil War began in 1999 when a rebel group backed by the government of neighboring Guinea, the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, LOURD, emerged in northern Liberia. In early 2003, a second rebel group, the Movement for Democracy in Liberia, MODEL, emerged in the south, and by June-July 2003, Charles Taylor's government controlled only a third of the country. The capital, Monrovia, was besieged by LOURD, and the group's shelling of the city resulted in the deaths of many civilians. Thousands of people were displaced from their homes as a result of the conflict. The Accra Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed by the warring parties on August 18, 2000, marking the political end of the conflict and the beginning of the country's transition to democracy under the National Transitional Government of Liberia, led by interim President Jude Bryant until the Liberian general election of 2005. Sierra Leone Civil War, 1991 to 2002. The Civil War in Sierra Leone began on 23rd of March 1991 as a result of an attempted overthrow against the administration of President Joseph Saidu Momo. The rebels went under the guise of the Revolutionary United Front, RUF, led by Fode Sanko, a previous army corporal. The Sierra Leonean government called for action, and soon the Sierra Leone Army, SLA, was sent in to control the situation and take back RUF-occupied territory. By 1992, President Joseph Momo was ousted by a successful military coup led by Captain Valentine Strasser. Captain Strasser soon established multi-party democratic elections in the region. On 18th of January 2002, the civil war was officially ended by former President Kaba. During the 11-year conflict, roughly 50,000 Sierra Leoneans were killed, with 2,000 displaced. Guinea Bissau's Civil War, 1998 to 1999. Before the Civil War began, an attempted coup d'etat took place led by military Brigadier General Ansoumana Mane. Mane, leading the coup, blamed the presidency of João Bernardo Vieira for the poverty and corruption of Guinea Bissau. President Vieira, controlling the armed forces, soon fired Mane from his position of Brigadier General. He was fired on charges of supplying Senegal rebels. On the 7th of June 1998, a second coup d'etat began. The coup once again failed. Soon after, rebels received aid from the neighboring nations of Senegal and Guinea-Conakry. The conflict sparked a civil war. Many soldiers in the armed forces of Guinea-Bissau joined the side of the rebels. This was in part due to the government not paying its soldiers. The rebels continued to fight from 1998 to 1999. President Vieira was ousted on 7 May 1999. By 10 May 1999, the war ended when President Vieira signed an unconditional surrender in a Portuguese embassy. Approximately 655 were killed as a result of the conflict. First Ivorian Civil War, 2000. In the early 2000s, the Ivory Coast, also known as Côte d'Ivoire, experienced an economic recession. The recession began as a result of the previous economic boom crashing the economy as a whole. This led to the predominantly Muslim north and predominantly Christian south of the Ivory Coast becoming politically divided. The southern Ivory Coast was in control of the Ivorian government. The north was under the control of the rebel movement. The civil war between the two began officially on the 19th September 2000, when rebels launched a series of attacks on the south. The city of Abidjan was primarily targeted. Northern rebels were successful in the attacks. As a result of the chaos, President Robert Guay was killed in the rebellions. The south retailed with military action. France supported the south and sent 100 soldiers to the region and called for United Nations action. French action in the area went under the guise and codename of Opération Licorne. By 2004, most fighting in the region ceased. On the 4th March 2007, the civil war officially ended with the signing of a peace treaty. Second Ivorian Civil War, 2010-2011. Historiographic and conceptual problems. The current major problem in African studies that Mohammed, 2010-2012, identified is the inherited religious, orientalist, colonial paradigm that European Africanists have preserved in present-day secularist, post-colonial, Anglophone African historiography. African and African-American scholars also bear some responsibility in perpetuating this European Africanist preserved paradigm. Following conceptualizations of Africa developed by Leo Africanus and Hegel, European Africanists conceptually separated continental Africa into two racialized regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, as a racist geographic construction, serves as an objectified, compartmentalized region of Africa proper, Africa Noir or Black Africa. The African diaspora is also considered to be a part of the same racialized construction as Sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa serves as a racialized region of European Africa, which is conceptually disconnected from Sub-Saharan Africa and conceptually connected to the Middle East, Asia, and the Islamic world. As a result of these racialized constructions and the conceptual separation of Africa, darker-skinned North Africans, such as the so-called Haratan, who have long resided in the Maghreb and do not reside south of Saharan Africa, have become analogically alienated from their indigeneity and historic reality in North Africa. While the origin of the term Haratin remains speculative, the term may not date much earlier than the 18th century CE and has been involuntarily assigned to darker-skinned Maghrebian. Prior to the modern use of the term Haratin as an identifier and utilized in contrast to Biden or Heidi Bih, white, Summer Asmar, Sud Aswad, or Sudan Sudani, black-brown, were Arabic terms utilized as identifiers for darker-skinned Maghrebians before the modern period. Haratin is considered to be an offensive term by the darker-skinned Maghrebians it is intended to identify. For example, people in the southern region